There are dreams so vivid, so full of fire, that they leave your hands shaking long after you've woken up. Mine often ended with my fists clenched so tight, my nails cut into my palms, not from fear, but from fury. Fury at a man I finally stood up to after years of silence. In those dreams, I say everything I once swallowed back, and in those dreams, I win. My name is Elizabeth Harris, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a little white house on a hill just outside Woodstock, Vermont, where the maple trees blush red every fall and the wind smells of pine and memory. This porch I'm sitting on, it's held me through storms both weathered and emotional. And these rocking chairs, well, they've heard more than their fair share of whispered regrets and quiet triumphs. Most evenings, I sit out here watching the sun dip below the hills, wrapped in my old shawl and listening to the hum of the world slowing down. Tonight feels like one of those moments when the past presses in a little heavier. Maybe it's the soft rustle of the leaves, or maybe it's just time I told the truth, my truth not as a warning, but as a legacy. See, when I was young, women like me didn't get far. We were expected to marry, raise children, keep quiet. We weren't supposed to lead, let alone survive the kind of war I did. Not a war with guns or soldiers, but one of paper cuts and whispered insults, of sabotage dressed up in smiles and sexist jokes passed off as harmless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. It was 1973, and I was just 24 years old, still raw from grief, still fumbling for a future after the war had taken Tommy Walker, my fiancé, and the only boy who ever made my knees weak just by smiling. He died in Da Nang, and with him, the version of life I thought I'd have a little farmhouse near my parents, kids, Sunday dinners, a garden. Instead, I packed up my life in 3 cardboard boxes and took the bus to Burlington, hoping to find more than sorrow and soil in the factory town everyone else tried to leave behind. I still remember my father's face when I told him I was leaving the farm, his jaw set like granite. No decent girl leaves her home for a job in a sewing factory, he'd muttered, turning back to his coffee like I'd insulted the family name. My mother didn't say much. She just stood quietly in the kitchen, wrapping a ham sandwich in wax paper and slipping $7 into the pocket of my coat when he wasn't looking. I boarded that bus with a broken heart, a half-filled suitcase, and more determination than sense. Burlington might as well have been New York to me back then. The buildings felt too close together, the sidewalks too fast. I moved into a boarding house run by Mrs. Talbot, a woman as rigid as the ironed pleats in her skirt. We had curfews, no men allowed, church attendance required. I shared a room with 2 other girls who worked shifts at Greenridge Textiles, the giant factory that loomed like a beast on the edge of town. My first day on the sewing line, the hum of machines nearly drowned out the thud of my own heartbeat. The fabric dust clung to everything, my clothes, my hair, even the corners of my lungs. I pricked my fingers so often I thought I might bleed out one patch at a time. But I worked. Lord, I worked. Because if I didn't, I knew I'd be right back in that farmhouse kitchen, hearing my father say, "I told you so." Unlike most of the other girls, I wasn't working just to pass the time until marriage. I didn't have anyone waiting for me. I poured myself into every stitch, every shift. I stayed late. I asked questions. I wanted to understand not just how the machines worked, but why the threads held or broke. That's when Mr. Walter Briggs, the oldest floor manager, noticed me. He was a quiet man, sharp-eyed, and didn't waste words. "Harris," he said one day, squinting at the hem I'd just finished, You've got a better eye for flaws than half the boys up in quality control. It was the first time anyone spoke to me like I was worth more than my hands. He encouraged me to apply for a supervisory assistant role when the previous one retired. Some of the women laughed. Some warned me not to get my hopes up, but I did it anyway. I signed the form with a pen that trembled in my fingers, and I changed the course of my life. That choice led me to a battlefield I didn't see coming. It led me to Frank Delaney and to a fight that would test everything I thought I knew about strength. But I'll get to that. For now, just know this: no matter how quiet a woman might seem, no matter how small the space she's given, she can still move mountains if she dares to write her own story. I was born and raised on a quiet stretch of land just outside Woodstock, Vermont, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons, planting in the spring, praying in the summer, and surviving through the long gray winters. My family's farm was humble but proud, passed down through 4 generations of Harris men. My father, Howard Harris, was the kind of man who believed in hard work, early mornings, and keeping emotions locked up tight. My mother, Lillian, was softer, a quiet woman with calloused hands who showed her love in packed lunches and warm pies, never in words. Growing up, I never questioned the life laid out before me. I'd help with chores until I married, maybe teach Sunday school or volunteer at church. I'd live within 5 miles of where I was born, just like everyone else I knew. But all of that changed the year I turned 18, the year Tommy Walker was drafted. Tommy and I had been inseparable since we were kids. He was the boy who gave me my first dandelion bouquet, the first to kiss me under the bleachers behind our high school gym. We planned to marry once he finished his tour, maybe build a little home on the edge of my parents' property, but Vietnam had other plans. The letter came on a rainy afternoon in April. He'd been killed by a landmine. For weeks, I wandered the farm in silence, unable to eat, unable to sleep. I'd lost not just the man I loved, but the future I thought I had. I remember lying in the hayloft one night, staring through a hole in the roof at the stars and thinking, is this it? Is this where my life ends before it even begins? Tommy's death hollowed something out inside me, but it also planted a seed, a need to prove that his life and mine could still mean something. I started talking less about settling down and more about getting out. I wanted to earn my own living, see new places, build a life that was mine, not something handed to me by tradition or expectation. The only place hiring women year-round was the Green Ridge Textiles Factory in Burlington, about 2 hours north by bus. When I told my parents I planned to leave, the kitchen went so quiet I could hear the tick of the wall clock. My father set down his fork, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "You walk away from this farm. Don't bother coming back." I waited for Mama to say something, anything, but she just stared at her lap. That silence hurt more than Daddy's words. It felt like grief all over again. The night before I left, I found Mama in the pantry, her hands shaking as she wrapped up some bread and ham in wax paper. "Your daddy's set in his ways," she whispered, not meeting my gaze. "But I believe in you, Lizzie. I always have." She slipped a folded $5 bill and 2 ones into my coat pocket. "It ain't much, but it's yours." I hugged her tight, inhaling the scent of flour and soap that always clung to her apron. I wanted to say 1,000 things, but all that came out was, "Thank you." I caught the morning bus to Burlington with a suitcase filled mostly with hand-me-downs and fear. I didn't know what city life would be like. I didn't even know if I'd last a week. The bus pulled away from the only home I'd ever known, and I watched it shrink in the distance through the fogged-up window. I didn't cry. Not then. I was too determined. Burlington was everything Woodstock wasn't. Loud, crowded, unfamiliar. I moved into a boarding house run by Mrs. Talbot, a widow with strict rules and a sharp tongue. Curfew was at 8:30 p.m., sharp, no men, no noise, no nonsense. I shared a room with 2 other girls, both working at Greenridge like I hoped to. They didn't say much to me that first night, just eyed me like I wouldn't last long. The factory hired me on the spot. Women were always needed on the sewing line. They gave me a faded apron, a locker, and a rundown on how to operate the single needle machine. The air inside the plant was thick with lint and oil, and the rhythmic pounding of the machines never let up. It was hard to breathe, harder to think. I pricked my fingers so many times that I bled through my bandages. Every evening, I dragged myself up the narrow stairs of the boarding house, stripped off my sweat-stiffened clothes, and scrubbed myself raw in the shared bathroom. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, the smell of fabric dye and grease stayed with me. Still, I didn't complain. I didn't give in. I told myself, you made this choice. Elizabeth, you're going to make it count. I worked the line for months, eyes burning, shoulders aching, hands calloused, while other girls talked about their boyfriends or dreams of marriage. I stayed behind after shifts, watching the floor managers check quality. I asked questions. How were orders processed? What determined a good stitch? What happened when mistakes slipped through? Most people ignored me, but not Mr. Walter Briggs. He was quiet, observant, and always kept a pocket notebook with him. Harris, he said one day, you're not just working, you're learning. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That was the first time someone saw what I saw in myself, not just a girl with something to prove, but a woman with something to offer. They say if you do a thing long enough, it becomes part of you. For me, that factory floor became like a second skin, grimy, noisy, and exhausting. Yes, but also alive with purpose. Every thread I pulled, every seam I stitched, felt like a small act of building something that was finally mine. While other girls counted down the hours, I stayed late. I learned not just how to sew, but how the entire system moved. I watched the supervisors manage inventory, assign shifts, and negotiate with production staff. Most of them were men loud, impatient, and quick to dismiss the women on the floor. But I studied them anyway, watching how they operated, and more importantly, where they fell short. Mr. Briggs, the floor manager who'd noticed me early on, had a memory like a steel trap and a low tolerance for laziness. He was gruff, but not unkind. I often found him jotting notes in that worn pocket notebook of his while walking the aisles. One afternoon, after I caught a misaligned hem that had slipped through 2 inspections, he stopped beside my station and said, "That's the 3rd time this week. Harris, you've got a sharper eye than half the supervisors upstairs." It wasn't meant as flattery. With Mr. Briggs, it was more like a field promotion in a war zone. A few days later, I overheard him speaking with Mr. Neil Patterson, the assistant supervisor of our department. She's got initiative. We need more like that. Mr. Patterson was in his 50s, worn at the edges but fair. He glanced over at me as I wiped my machine down, not realizing I could hear them. Maybe she'll last. Most girls burn out by the 2nd year. I didn't say a word, but my heart swelled with something I hadn't felt since before Tommy died. Hope. Real, breathing hope. So when word spread in early 1974 that Mr. Patterson was being transferred to the Albany plant. I knew what I had to do. The position of assistant supervisor would open up, and even though no woman had ever held that role before, I put my name in. I expected whispers. I got laughter. Nancy Muller, who'd stitched 2 machines down from me since I started, pulled me aside during lunch. "You serious?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. "Lizzie, no offense, but that's not a place for us. You think they're going to let a woman tell the men what to do?" I just looked at her and said, "I'm not trying to tell men what to do. I'm trying to do the job right." She shook her head and walked away, but I saw something flicker in her eyes before she did uncertainty, not dismissal, and that meant something. When I submitted my application, I half expected the HR clerk to tear it up in front of me. Instead, she just stamped it and slid it into a file folder with barely a glance. I went home that night, feeling like I'd tossed a stone into a lake without knowing if it would skip or sink. 2 weeks passed, then 3, then 1 Monday morning. Mr. Briggs called me into his office. I wiped my hands on my apron, heart thudding. He didn't offer me a chair. "Mr. Langston wants to see you." Upstairs, where the air smelled different, less like sweat and dye, more like paper and coffee. I climbed those stairs one at a time, my legs trembling slightly with each step. Inside the office, Mr. Gerald Langston, the plant director, sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a bank, not a factory. He didn't smile. "Miss Harris," he began, folding his hands. "Let's get one thing straight. Corporate's been pushing these new equal opportunity initiatives, and we've been told to show we're participating. I've been instructed to promote someone from the floor to assistant supervisor, and you're the most qualified female candidate." He said it like I'd won a door prize at a county fair, not earned my way forward with late nights and bloody fingers. One mistake, one production slip, and it all goes away. "Understand?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." "You start next Monday." Dismissed. That was it. No congratulations, no handshake, not even eye contact. But I didn't care. I walked out of that office with my head held high. I was going to be the first woman in Green Ridge's history to step into a supervisory role. That night, I sat on the narrow twin bed in my tiny room at Mrs. Talbot's, shaking as I wrote to Mama. I told her the truth, but not all of it. I left out Mr. Langston's warning, the coldness in his voice. I just said, "Mama, I did it. I got the promotion. I'm somebody now. I hope Daddy can forgive me one day." I slid the letter into an envelope with trembling hands. What I didn't know then was that the real challenge, the one that would change my life and nearly break me, was just beginning. Monday came faster than I was ready for, and with it, the beginning of a chapter I could never have predicted. I arrived at the factory 30 minutes early, my new title sitting heavy on my chest like a medal I wasn't sure I'd earned. The morning shift hadn't begun yet. The sewing floor was still and quiet, bathed in pale light filtering through high factory windows. I stood at the glass-walled office that now bore my name on a paper placard, Elizabeth Harris, asked supervisor, sewing depth. I had barely set down my clipboard when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing through the factory like warning drums. I turned and met Frank Delaney for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back gray-streaked hair and a permanent smirk that curled just a little too high on one side. His pale blue eyes scanned me like I was something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "So," he said, not offering a handshake, You're the girl they're trying to pass off as management." The word girl stung more than I let show. "I'm Elizabeth Harris," I replied, standing straighter, "and I'm here to ensure the department continues meeting its production goals." He laughed, a short, sharp exhale through his nose that carried no humor. "We'll see how long this little experiment lasts," he muttered. I forced a smile. "I imagine it'll last as long as I do the job well, Mr. Delaney." His lips twitched again, but he said nothing more, just turned and walked away like he'd already dismissed me. That was day one. The days that followed felt like walking across ice that was cracking under every step. It started small production schedules suddenly changing without notice, memos mysteriously disappearing from my inbox. When I brought it up, Delaney always had a convenient excuse or a smug look that said, "Prove it." At our first management meeting, I walked in to find my chair missing. The other men chuckled while Frank said, "Must have been the janitor. Didn't know we had ladies in attendance. I had to pull a chair from another room while they watched." And that was just week one. He didn't stop. If anything, he got bolder. A few days later, I found out that the start time for my entire department had been changed, but no one had told me. The floor was chaos. We lost nearly $600 in production that day. Mr. Langston called me in, slid a written warning across the desk, and said flatly, "Don't let it happen again." I wanted to scream, to cry, to fight. But instead, I signed the paper, walked back to my office, and stared at the wall until the sting left my eyes. That night, I sobbed into my pillow, shaking from a rage I didn't know how to release. I had worked so hard. I had earned this position. And yet, here I was being sabotaged by a man who refused to believe a woman belonged anywhere but behind a sewing machine. But I'd grown up on a farm. I knew what it meant to fight for something with your bare hands and your grit alone. And I hadn't come this far just to quit. The months that followed were like navigating a minefield. Delaney micromanaged every decision I made. He'd show up on the floor during quality checks, point out imaginary flaws in front of my team, and say loudly, "Is this what passes for quality now?" "Miss Harris, maybe homemaking would be more your speed." And yet I endured. I had women like Jeanette Wallace, who left apples or cookies on my desk when things got rough, and Tina Caldwell, young but sharp as a tack, who'd stay late with me to help the department catch up on quotas. "Don't you let that man run you out," she whispered once. My grandma always said devil works hardest against those he's scared of. Frank didn't realize one thing even with all his power. He couldn't outwork me. He could throw every wrench he wanted into the gears, but my department still ran. Slowly at first, but more efficiently than before. The women trusted me because I'd been one of them. I didn't bark orders, I listened. I taught. I encouraged. I led from the same floor they worked on. By the 6-month mark, our numbers were improving. Reject rates dropped. Output went up. And Frank, he noticed. That's when he escalated. It was a sweltering July, and we were working overtime to fulfill a major order for a department store chain in Boston. I had personally double-checked every shipment. But the day before it was to be sent, Frank marched onto the floor with Langston and 2 well-dressed clients from the Boston office. "This is our sewing department," he said cheerfully, "where we've had some interesting quality concerns." My stomach dropped. I stepped forward. "Mr. Delaney, we've completed inspection. Everything is clean." He smiled condescendingly. "Is that so, gentlemen? If you'll examine these." He pulled out 3 shirts each with glaring flaws, puckered seams, misaligned buttons, uneven collars. They were not from my department. Please explain how these passed inspection. Mr. Langston said, ice in his voice. I froze, but only for a second. These shirts, I said, holding one up, have purple thread markers. As of 3 weeks ago, per Mr. Delaney's instruction, my department now uses blue markers. These didn't come from us. Silence. Langston turned slowly. Is that true? Frank hesitated, then shrugged. They're samples from the reject bin, just for demonstration, but the damage was done. One of the clients turned to me and said, "We've worked with Green Ridge for years. This is the first time we've gotten an order early, with 0 rejects. Whatever you're doing, ma'am, keep it up." It was a small win, a crack in Frank's armor. But I wasn't naive. I knew it wouldn't end there. The next morning, I found a dead mouse in my desk drawer, and still I didn't break, because now I was done just surviving. I was ready to fight back. I didn't scream when I saw the dead mouse in my desk drawer. I didn't cry either. I simply shut the drawer, locked it, and kept working. Frank Delaney wanted a reaction. He wanted me to flinch, to quit, to vanish back into the sewing line where he thought I belonged. But what he didn't understand was that I had already survived worse. I had buried the man I loved. I had left everything I knew behind. I had rebuilt myself from nothing but grief and stubborn hope. A rodent wasn't going to scare me, but that didn't mean I wasn't tired. By the end of that summer, I was running on fumes. I had lost nearly 10 pounds. My temples throbbed with migraines that wouldn't quit. I jumped at every sudden noise, and the joy I used to feel walking onto the factory floor had been replaced with dread. Frank never let up. After the mouse, the women's restroom closest to our department suddenly went under maintenance. My girls had to walk clear across the building, cutting into their already short breaks. When I submitted a request to fix the plumbing, it got lost in the system. Then came the air conditioning, or rather the lack of it. Our section of the factory sat baking under the August sun while the adjacent departments cooled in relative comfort. I reported it 3 times. Nothing happened. And still, we stitched. We endured. I brought in small desk fans from home, one for each woman. I rearranged break schedules to maximize efficiency. I stayed 2 hours late each night, double-checking production logs, copying files, and storing them in my car just in case. Frank's campaign had become personal and calculated, but the more he tried to bury me, the more determined I became to grow from it. Still, I knew this wasn't sustainable. I couldn't just keep reacting. I had to fight smarter. It was during a weekend trip to the farm, what should have been a restful visit with Mama and Daddy, that something finally clicked. Mama pressed a cold cloth to my forehead as I lay curled on their old couch, a pounding headache making my vision blur. "You're working too hard, Elizabeth," she whispered. "No job is worth this." I wanted to agree. I wanted to quit and come home, but I couldn't. I have to finish what I started. "Mama," I murmured. To my surprise, Daddy, who had been sitting silently by the window, spoke up. "Ain't about finishing. It's about fighting smart," he said without turning. "You don't wrestle a pig in the mud. Lizzie, all you get is dirty, and the pig likes it." I laughed weakly, but the words stayed with me. Fight smart. That night, back in Burlington, I emptied the contents of my purse onto the kitchen table and stared at a half-used notepad I'd carried for grocery lists. I picked it up slowly and wrote the date at the top of the page, September 3rd, 1974. Then I wrote, "Frank Delaney changed the air conditioning request, submitted on August 28 from urgent to non-essential status. Source maintenance clerk, Joanne." She confirmed no similar requests in adjacent departments were altered. Entire team affected by high heat and reported symptoms. I paused. Then I wrote 2 more entries from memory. It felt small, insignificant, like tossing pebbles at a stone wall, but I kept writing. Every day, every incident, every pattern. I noted names, dates, phrases. I taped in memos that contradicted each other. I recorded quotes from overheard conversations. I logged unexplained schedule changes and sudden errors in paperwork. I documented timesheets altered to make it look like my team took longer breaks than allowed. It wasn't much at first. But by the end of the month, that little spiral notebook was nearly full, and I was starting to see the pattern more clearly than ever. Still, I knew a notebook alone wouldn't be enough. I needed witnesses, people who saw what I saw and were brave enough to speak when the time came. That required strategy. So I started small. Carolyn Brooks in accounting was the first. She was in her 50s, walked with a limp, and didn't care for nonsense. I approached her in the ladies' room, one of the only places we could speak without being overheard. "Carolyn," I said gently, "have you ever noticed changes to department timesheets after approval?" She looked at me long and hard. "You mean how Frank's been doctoring your girls' breaks to make it look like you're slacking?" My stomach flipped. "You've seen that." She nodded. "I keep my own records, not official. Just for sanity. Want to compare? I met her the next day at Woolworth's lunch counter during our break. She slid a small manila envelope across the table. Inside were copies of her ledgers, timestamps, break logs, deliberate inconsistencies. "Use it how you will," she muttered. "But be careful. Frank plays dirty." She wasn't wrong. Still, Carolyn wasn't the last. A week later, Eddie Coleman from maintenance admitted that Frank had ordered him to deprioritize our department's repair requests, even when machines sat broken for days. Then Linda Ramirez from HR quietly confirmed that at least 3 internal applications to join my team had mysteriously disappeared before I ever saw them. Each piece of information went into my second notebook. I kept the notebooks hidden in an old cookie tin under my kitchen sink, my personal archive of a war waged in whispers. But for the first time in months, I felt something rising inside me that Frank Delaney hadn't managed to kill clarity, purpose, fire. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every woman who worked that floor and every girl who'd come after us. And I wasn't going to let that fire die, not this time. The more I wrote, the clearer the picture became. Each scribbled date, each memo tucked between the pages, each overheard comment noted in the margins. What started as a survival tactic had become a blueprint, a map of sabotage, intimidation, and manipulation carefully woven by Frank Delaney. He thought he was burying me under confusion and exhaustion. What he didn't know was that I was collecting his dirt, one handful at a time. By mid-October, I had filled my second notebook. I kept both at home, hidden inside an old ceramic flower canister that had belonged to my mother. Frank might control the hallways and office mailboxes, but he didn't control my kitchen. Still, notebooks alone wouldn't be enough. I needed voices, witnesses, and I knew how risky that was. Most of the women on the floor were single mothers, widows, or sole breadwinners like I had once been. Speaking out could cost them everything. I wasn't going to ask them to stick their necks out for me or for anyone. But the men, some of them might be reachable. Eddie Coleman had already spoken up about maintenance delays. He didn't like Frank, but he didn't want to be seen as insubordinate either. "You ain't heard it from me," he told me one day, pushing a copy of a repair slip across my desk. "But if you did, I'd say the reason machine 4 ain't been fixed is because someone told me not to." I didn't press further. I just nodded. Understood. Carolyn Brooks remained my quiet anchor. She continued to slip me evidence whenever she could, updated ledgers, original time logs before Frank altered them, notes showing missing hours reallocated without explanation. "This one's going to sting," she whispered one morning, passing me a folded page in the break room. "Shows he deducted 15 minutes a day from your girls' break time on paper. Makes it look like they're dragging their heels." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it from the bottom of my heart. Then came Linda Ramirez. Linda worked in HR. She was kind, careful, and always polite. I never thought she'd be the one to speak up, but I underestimated her. One day she passed me in the hallway and paused, barely glancing my way. 3 internal applications, 2 from skilled women, 1 from a vet, never reached you, she said softly. They were left on Frank's desk for forwarding. They disappeared. I blinked. Can you prove that she didn't answer? But the next day, a small envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside, copies of those missing applications, names, dates, signatures, proof. I added them to my growing archive. By the time the first snow fell in early November, I had built a case that even Frank couldn't talk his way out of, but I still hadn't decided what to do with it. Not yet. And then he struck again. It was a Monday morning when I received a thin manila folder labeled Performance Review, Elizabeth Harris. I opened it slowly, and my stomach twisted. He had rated me a 1 out of 5 in every category except punctuality, which he generously marked as a 3. Leadership, communication, problem solving, team building, all marked incompetent. I knew what that meant. That kind of review could sink my career, even if I wasn't fired. No one would promote a woman with scores like those. It was Frank's checkmate move. I sat in my office for over an hour just staring at the paper, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. All I'd done, all I'd built. And with a few strokes of a pen, he was trying to erase it. But I wasn't the woman I'd been a year ago. I went home that night and laid out everything, both notebooks, every memo, every signed witness statement, every altered log and scheduling discrepancy. I arranged them into folders, color-coded and labeled. It looked like something a lawyer might bring to trial, and maybe that's what it was. A trial of truth. I practiced what I'd say, in front of my mirror, in the dark, out loud in the kitchen, while making tea. Every word had to be calm, professional, unshakable. Then I made an appointment. Mr. Gerald Langston's secretary raised an eyebrow when I told her the reason: workplace harassment and sabotage. I have documentation. She blinked twice before writing it down. He can see you Thursday at 2 p.m. I nodded. I'll be there. The next 2 days, I hardly slept. I combed through every page, double-checking dates and cross-referencing entries. I knew how this would go. Frank would deny everything, maybe even call me emotional, hysterical, vindictive, but I had paperwork, I had proof, and more than that, I had nothing left to lose. Thursday came with a gray sky and a biting wind. I wore my best navy suit, the one I'd bought with my first supervisor paycheck, and my mother's pearl earrings. I tied my hair into a neat bun and carried my folders in a satchel slung over one shoulder. At 2 p.m. sharp, I knocked on Langston's office door. "Come in, Miss Harris." He wasn't alone. Frank Delaney was already seated across from Langston's desk, legs crossed, arms smugly folded. He turned and gave me a crooked grin. I took the liberty of inviting Mr. Delaney, Langston said, not quite meeting my eyes. Given that your concerns involve his department, for a moment, panic rose in my throat. But then I remembered every late night, every insult, every piece of paper with his lies on it. I sat down and calmly opened my folder. Actually, sir, that makes things easier. My concerns do involve Mr. Delaney, but not his department. They involve his coordinated effort to sabotage mine. Frank scoffed. Robert, come on. I told you she'd pull this. Women don't know how to lead, so they blame the first man who doesn't pat them on the back. I didn't flinch. Instead, I placed my first stack of documents on the desk. These are altered production schedules, all changed without my knowledge. Here are copies of maintenance requests that went unanswered. And these, I said as I placed another bundle beside them, are the original and falsified time logs provided by accounting. Langston reached forward, his expression tightening. Frank shifted in his seat. I kept going. I presented evidence after evidence, calmly, precisely, like a surgeon making clean cuts. And when I reached the end, I said, and this performance review, it directly contradicts our department's data verified by accounting and quality control. The room fell into stunned silence. Langston cleared his throat. These are serious allegations. Miss Harris. They will require investigation. I met his gaze. I understand. I should add that several employees are willing to submit statements, as are 2 clients who were misled about production delays. That got his attention. Frank Delaney didn't laugh this time. He just sat there, pale and silent. And for the first time since I'd stepped into that office, I felt the balance shift. I had turned my pain into proof, and I was finally being heard. 3 days passed after the meeting with Mr. Langston, and in all that time, the factory was quiet, unnervingly. So, Frank Delaney hadn't shown his face on the production floor, and the usual atmosphere of subtle tension had shifted to one of cautious curiosity. The other supervisors kept their heads down, and the women in my department whispered behind their machines, throwing me glances that asked a silent question. What happened? I gave them the same answer every time. Focus on the Johnson & Johnson order. Everything else will sort itself out. Inside, though, I was a mess of nerves. I replayed the meeting in my mind 100 times, every word I spoke, every document I placed on the desk. I wasn't naive. I knew how this could go. Companies protect themselves first. Even when they knew the truth, they'd often bury it to avoid scandal or lawsuits, especially when it was a woman making the accusation. But I also knew I hadn't just made accusations. I had delivered evidence, chapter and verse, time-stamped, signed, corroborated. And if that wasn't enough, I had more. A 3rd notebook, 5 more statements from employees, and names of clients who would back up my claims if needed. On the 4th morning, just after the first shift had begun, Mr. Langston's secretary appeared at my office door. Mr. Langston would like to see you. Her tone was unreadable. I stood slowly, smoothed my skirt, and nodded. Thank you. The walk to his office felt like it stretched for miles. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. I wouldn't let Frank or anyone else see me shake. Langston was alone this time. His desk, always cluttered, had been cleared except for one familiar folder. Mine. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down, Miss Harris. I did. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. I've reviewed your documentation, he began, tapping the folder with one finger. And I've spoken with several employees, Carolyn Brooks, Eddie Coleman, Linda Ramirez. I also reached out to the representatives from Dillard's, who confirmed your version of events regarding the shirt quality incident. I didn't speak. I just waited. He looked up at me, his expression graver than I'd ever seen. It appears there has been a situation developing in this department that I was not fully aware of. Still, I waited. My fingers gripped the arms of the chair. Effective immediately. He said, "Mr. Delaney has been transferred to our Albany facility. They needed a floor manager, and his name was available." I blinked. Transferred. Not fired. Not reprimanded. Just relocated. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly tempered by the reality. This was as far as they were willing to go. "I understand," I said calmly, though a part of me burned inside. Langston looked vaguely uncomfortable. "Let's be clear, Miss Harris, the company is not making any admission of wrongdoing regarding Mr. Delaney's management style. This is simply a personnel adjustment. For operational efficiency, of course it was." He cleared his throat again. "Your performance review has also been revised. I've personally evaluated your department's data and found your work to be more than satisfactory. That, at least, was something." "Thank you, sir." He wasn't finished. "There's one more matter," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Corporate has been reviewing department-level performance reports from across the factory. Yours stands out, especially given the challenges. They've approved the creation of a new position, Assistant Production Manager, with oversight of multiple departments, reporting directly to me." I stared at him. "You're offering me a promotion." He gave the barest hint of a smile. "Consider it recognition of your persistence and your attention to detail. Skills the company now realizes have value." I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'd be honored to accept." "Good. You'll begin Monday. You'll want to start training a replacement for your current position. Perhaps that young woman, Tina Caldwell, who's been holding the line when you're away." I smiled. "She'd be perfect." He nodded and stood. "One more thing. Miss Harris. Yes, if you're wise, you'll keep those notebooks of yours handy. Something tells me you may need them again." I almost laughed. I already bought a fresh one. "Sir." Walking back through the factory floor that day, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. The hum of the machines, the smell of fabric and oil, the dust and the light streaming from the high windows. It all washed over me, familiar but changed. For the first time since I stepped into management, I felt like I belonged. That evening, I called my parents. It was snowing lightly in Woodstock, and I could hear the fire crackling in the background as Mama answered. "Elizabeth," she said, surprised. "Is Daddy there?" A moment later. His voice came through the line, rough and steady as ever. "I took your advice. Daddy," I said. I fought smart. There was a pause. Then he chuckled softly, and it warmed me from 3 hours away. Never doubted it. "Lizzie, your mama and I didn't raise a fool. My first day as assistant production manager started the same way my first day on the sewing line had begun years earlier before sunrise, with butterflies in my stomach and a prayer in my heart. Only this time, I wasn't walking into that factory as a girl trying to prove she belonged. I was walking in as a woman who had earned her place and was ready to help others do the same. My new office was upstairs, overlooking 3 departments instead of 1. The walls were thin, the desk was a little wobbly, and the light flickered when it rained, but to me, it felt like a cathedral, not because of the title on the door, but because of what it represented. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building, and the first thing I built was a path forward for someone else. That someone was Tina Caldwell. She was just 22, full of ideas and quiet fire. I'd seen her work late, help others without being asked, and fix machines the older techs couldn't figure out. She didn't just care about the work, she cared about the people doing it. So I called her into my office and said, "I want you to take over my department." Her eyes widened like I'd offered her the moon. Me. "But I mean, I've never. You've already done the job. Tina, you just didn't have the title. And now you will." She blinked back tears, then straightened her shoulders. "I won't let you down. I know," I said. "That's why I picked you." Helping Tina into that role became my first real act as a leader, not as a manager, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had climbed and turned around to hold out a hand. It wasn't easy for her. The same whispers I'd once endured now followed her. Supervisors questioned her authority. Men talked over her in meetings. One even left a Barbie doll in her locker with a note that read, "Maybe try this before you try bossing us." I told her what I knew by heart. Document everything. Stay calm. Stay sharp. And remember, you're not alone. That was the biggest difference now. I wasn't alone anymore. Other women started stepping forward, quietly at first. They applied for roles they'd never dared to dream about. They questioned processes that had always favored the loudest men. Some even started keeping their own notebooks. It wasn't a revolution with signs and speeches. It was a quiet shift, a slow but steady awakening inside the walls of Green Ridge Textiles. By March of 1976, we had our third female supervisor, Deborah Green, from the cutting department. By the end of that year, 5 of the 12 supervisory positions were held by women, not because of quotas or mandates, but because we were damn good at what we did. It was during one of our monthly meetings when Mr. Langston, still stiff, still formal, looked around the room, glanced at me and Tina and Deborah, and muttered, "Well, it appears times are changing." He wasn't thrilled about it, but he didn't fight it anymore. Progress had a way of making even the reluctant recognize results. And the numbers spoke for themselves. Productivity up 17%. Reject rates down 12%. Employee retention the highest it had been in 10 years. It wasn't magic. It was what happened when people felt seen, supported, and safe enough to try. Looking back now, I don't think Frank Delaney ever imagined that in trying to crush me. He'd plant the very seed of change he so deeply feared. Every barrier he built, we climbed. Every door he slammed, we found another way in. And slowly, steadily, the factory that had once been a battlefield for me became a space where women could lead, grow, and breathe. Not perfectly, not easily, but finally freely. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself dreaming again, not about revenge, not about survival, but about what might come next. The funny thing about progress is that once it starts moving, it rarely goes backward. It might stall, it might face resistance, but it doesn't retreat, not when it's been earned through sweat, scars, and sheer will. By the time 1979 rolled around, Green Ridge Textiles looked nothing like the factory I had walked into as a wide-eyed 20-something in a hand-me-down coat. The walls were the same. The machine still hummed. But the culture, the soul of the place was different, and I had become part of that difference. Under Margaret Whitmore, the sharp and commanding woman who took over as factory director from Chicago, We started implementing changes that once would have been laughed out of the boardroom: equal pay, regardless of gender, performance-based promotions, a small on-site daycare, so women didn't have to choose between their jobs and their children. It was revolutionary in the textile world, and it worked. I was no longer alone in meetings. I no longer had to raise my voice to be heard. I had a seat at the table, and now I helped build the table for others. The spiral notebooks I'd once kept in secret were now tucked neatly in a box under my desk in my new office. By then, there were 12 of them, each one a silent testament to what it had taken to get here. Sometimes, when a young woman would knock on my door, eyes wide with uncertainty or burning with frustration, I'd take out those notebooks, lay them across the desk, and say, "You're not crazy. You're not imagining it. You're just seeing clearly what others pretend not to see." Then I'd teach them how to fight, not with fists, not with fury, but with records, evidence, strategy, and solidarity. It worked. Some of those women became supervisors. Some became department heads. A few went on to lead in other companies, other towns, other industries. But they all carried something with them, a piece of this movement we'd started in the dusty corners of a textile factory in Burlington, Vermont. And then, in 1982, Margaret was promoted to a corporate role in Boston. The news came with a meeting and a handshake, and she looked me square in the eye and said, "They're going to need someone to lead this place the way it's meant to be led. I recommended you." I was stunned. "No one's ever named a woman factory director before," I whispered. She smiled. No one had ever named a woman assistant manager either, but here we are. When the official announcement came, the reaction was mixed. Some clapped, some nodded with respect, and a few, mostly older men who had long since learned to avoid direct confrontation, just pursed their lips and said nothing. But none of that mattered, because as of October 1st, 1982, I, Elizabeth Harris, daughter of a wheat farmer from Woodstock, Vermont, became the factory director of Green Ridge Textiles. I kept my office simple, no gold nameplate, no fancy leather chairs, just a window overlooking the factory floor and a photo of my parents beside my desk. And beneath that desk, in the same box, rested the spiral notebooks that had carried me through the darkest years of my career. Every now and then, I'd pull them out not to relive the pain, but to remember the strength, to remind myself that change isn't born from permission. It's born from persistence. And whenever I felt doubt creeping in, I'd open a page at random, run my finger over the faded ink, and hear my younger self whisper, "Write it down. Stand your ground. You are not alone." I retired from Green Ridge in the spring of 1995, just a few weeks after my 65th birthday. There wasn't a grand parade or a corporate plaque or one of those speeches that ends up in the company newsletter. But what there was something far more meaningful. That day, as I stood in the canteen surrounded by dozens of faces, women I had trained, men who had once doubted me but now looked at me with earned respect, and even a few of the newer hires who knew my name only from whispered stories, Tina Caldwell stepped forward, holding a gift. It was a leather-bound journal. Embossed on the cover in gold were 3 words for the next chapter. She placed it gently in my hands and said, "We thought you might want to keep writing, just in case the world still needs your voice." I hugged her, and I did cry that time, not because I was sad to leave, but because I was proud of what I was leaving behind. Today, I sit here on my porch in Woodstock, Vermont, my fingers curled around a warm mug, the journal resting on the small wooden table beside me. The golden light of early evening spills across the fields, and the breeze carries the scent of damp leaves and pine. It's been 29 years since I last walked the floor of that factory. And yet, I still hear the hum of those machines sometimes in my dreams. I still remember the scent of fabric oil on my hands. And I still remember the voice inside me, the one that had been quiet for so long that finally whispered, "It's time to stand up." I think back often to the women who didn't get to finish their story the way I did, the ones who didn't have a notebook or a witness or someone to believe them, the ones who broke quietly under pressure, who left jobs they loved, who never dared to fight back because no one told them they could. And that's why I've told mine. Not because I think I'm special, not because I need recognition, but because there are still Frank Delaney's in the world in boardrooms, in small town offices, in corner cubicles, and there are still Elizabeth Harris's women who see, who try, who endure, and who need to know that they are not alone. If you're one of them, if you're watching or listening to this and thinking, "That sounds like me," then I want you to hear me clearly. You matter. Your truth matters. And your strength, yes. Even the trembling, quiet kind is enough. Keep your records. Build your case. Trust your gut. Speak when it's time. And if no one gives you a seat at the table, bring your own chair. Heck, build your own table if you must. Just don't sit in silence, because silence is where injustice hides, and courage is what pulls it into the light. We don't always get to choose the battles we face, but we do get to choose how we show up, with integrity, with resilience, and with the quiet, steady force of someone who refuses to disappear. So if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, know that your story doesn't end there. It begins when you decide to write it. And if my story meant something to you today, if it reminded you of someone you love or stirred something inside you, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're from, tell me your story, or just say hello. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about strength, hope, and the quiet power of persistence, please consider subscribing to the channel. My granddaughter Lily says it helps these messages reach more people who need them. Thank you for sitting with me. The sun is setting now, but the light is still warm, and somewhere, I believe, another woman is picking up her pen.